Danny Michael serves as the Robert W. Woodruff Curator of the Cody Firearms Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. Before that, he was the Associate Curator and Collections Assistant at the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. He co-founded the International Arsenals of History Symposium and its accompanying publications, fostering collaboration among museums and firearms historians worldwide. He contributes to and is published in Armax, the Journal of Contemporary Arms, and Arms and Armor, Journal of Royal Armories. He also appeared on Guns and Ammo TV, and he co-hosts History Unloaded, the Cody Firearms Museum podcast. Danny holds a bachelor's degree in history from Cedarville University in Ohio and a master's degree in public history from the University of Louisville. He's researched extensively on military small arms and the history of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Ladies and gentlemen, Danny Michael.
Thank you, and thank you to Susanna, and thank you to all the staff here at the Bryan Museum for being so gracious to have me here with you tonight. Thank you all for coming out and being interested in this topic. As she said, I am Danny Michael. I'm the curator of the Cody Firearms Museum. The Cody Firearms Museum is located in Cody, Wyoming, so hopefully that's easy to remember. If you don't know where that is, we are the last town on the east side of Yellowstone National Park. So if you've ever gone out to Yellowstone and coming in from the east side, you will drive through Cody and you will drive right past the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, which is our parent organization. We are 5 museums, and as I wandered the museum here this afternoon before this talk, I really enjoyed the similarities in that there's firearms here, there's Western history here, there's art. That's very similar to what we do. We have 5 museums. The Cody Firearms Museum, the Whitney Western Art Museum, the Plains Indian Museum, the Buffalo Bill Museum for our namesake, Buffalo Bill, and the Draper Natural History Museum. So you can get a little bit of everything about the West when you come out and see us in the center of the West. And my other sales pitch is, I don't know if this is hot or cold or pleasant for you guys. I'm feeling pretty warm today. I went to a branding on Saturday and it was about 40 degrees. So it's been a big change to come down here. So if you're looking for a getaway in the summer, Cody is nice and cool and low humidity. So what I'm talking to you tonight is firearms in the American West. That's something I've come to know a lot about given my field and my museum. And we're going to work in some of the firearms from the collections here at the Bryan Museum. A couple of special pieces are here on view for this talk. And so I really enjoyed seeing some of the collection and getting to learn a little bit about them. There's a really great firearms collection here, as I'm sure you all know. And so we'll be talking about firearms in the West. I'm going to sort of work you through firearms history broadly and help you hopefully place some of those guns that you see here, both on the table and when you go visit the museum in context. So with that, we'll jump in. And so when we think of guns of the West, we think of mostly these kind of guns, in my opinion. Feel free to disagree or write me an angry email later. But we think of Winchester lever actions and Colt revolvers pretty much. There's a main reason for that. The main reason being the classic Western movie. We've all probably seen an old Western. In those movies, regardless of the time period they're depicting, regardless of the setting, regardless of the story, the guns are almost always lever action rifles and Colt revolvers. There's a few exceptions. If you ever watch a movie with me, prepared to be bored out of your mind by my commentary, I will tell you all the minute details and ruin the movie as much as possible for you. So I'm really fun at parties. But we see those because when they were making these movies, those were the guns that were easily available. They were easy to work with for the producers on set, for the prop guys on set. They could use the same blanks, a very famous, it's called a 5-in-1 blank, if you know your movie history, that they could use across several different guns. So that's why we see them. And when they're making these movies in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there's no army of internet keyboard warriors to tell them they got it wrong. So they could just do whatever they wanted, really. And they could tell the story, and the gun is often not maybe the important part of the story. It's there to serve its purpose. But we come to think of that then when we picture the West, we're picturing these scenes and we're picturing those guns. So we think of those, but there's a lot more beyond that. And so my job as a firearms historian, I look at a lot of things. We look at things like what we're trying to get, what was actually involved in the American West. And we're talking sort of broadly about the American West here, right? So I'm from Wyoming, you guys were here in Texas. There's a lot of places that can, capture part of the American West. We're talking about the early West, we're talking about, Ohio and the Appalachians. But we look at surviving firearms. That's a great, collections like this here at the Bryan Museum, at our collection, other museum collections. What survived? That tells us what was being used. We look at, military records and photographs. This is a great photograph we're going to come back to in a little bit, but we see a pile of guns down here, and we can look and see what those guys had in that photo. We can date the photo. We can learn a little bit about what they were carrying. There's certainly written accounts, mountain men and sheriffs and other people are writing down what they're using, generally not as specifically as we'd like them to be. It's very often a gun or a rifle or a pistol, but sometimes that tells us about what they're doing. Archival records, one of the things we have at the Cody Firearms Museum is if you know about us and you've known us for a while, there's a few folks out there that still know us as the Winchester Arms Museum. So our history is that we used to be the Winchester Arms Museum, and we grew out of the Winchester Company reference collection. So they kept a wide collection of guns they made, guns their competitors made. They also kept their records, and those have survived to us. So the ledger you see there on the screen, that's a production ledger where they wrote down by serial number what gun they were making. So we have some idea, hey, here's what they made, here's what it looked like. Occasionally we have customer records for them and some other manufacturers, but that kind of primary source document is really important in trying to understand what the material culture, which firearms were a part of, was like in the West. Like I said, remember this photo, we're coming back to it. So the early West, we're talking about the very early West in sort of national history, after the US became a country, after the American Revolution. And we think of folks like Lewis and Clark. So these are examples of guns that you would see if you were a member of Lewis and Clark's party headed out west. They carried some rifles. They carried a lot of what we would now call the Model 1795 musket, a flintlock musket. So that is a muzzle-loaded musket. Powder and projectile go in the barrel. You pour some powder in the pan. When you cock the gun, there's a flint in those jaws that creates a spark when it strikes the steel frizzen in front of it. That sets off the gun. That's, if you've seen, the classic Mel Gibson's The Patriot. They're using a lot of flintlocks. I won't get into the other historical issues with the movie, but like I said, I'm really fun at parties. Another really interesting firearm from this group especially is the lower gun. That's an air rifle. A lot of people aren't aware that air rifles were around in this time period, but that is an air rifle. And in it, the buttstock is a reservoir. It was originally an Austrian military gun in the late 1700s. A couple of them made their way to the US. Somehow, Lewis and Clark got their hands on one. The other interesting thing about it is it's magazine fed. So there's a small tube on the right-hand side there, just in front of the cocking piece, that holds 20 projectiles. The air reservoir serves as your instead of your gunpowder, that's where you're getting your energy from. So you can cock and fire that gun 20 times without reloading. And they took one of those along with them on their, as part of the Corps of Discovery. They took that with them. It's described very extensively in their journals. It's thought they mostly used it as sort of a diplomacy tool because Native Americans certainly had seen firearms. Firearms actually traveled west quicker than Europeans, but they probably hadn't seen an air rifle, so it was sort of an interesting and sort of demonstrative technology that they could show off. And they used that in the Corps of Discovery. A little bit later, thinking like 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, we think of the Mountain Man era. Who's seen the Robert Redford movie, Jeremiah Johnson? There's always a few. So that's the kind of gun we're talking here. We're talking a Hawken rifle. It's named for the Hawken brothers, Jacob and Samuel Hawken. They mostly made these guns in St. Louis for folks headed out west. They are percussion rifles instead of the flintlock. They made flintlocks, but they're most famous for their percussion rifles. So instead of that, the piece of flint striking the steel to make a spark, now it's a percussion, a little copper cap that makes your spark. And inside that cap is a compound. It's very safe, very non-cancerous, very non-toxic, mercury fulminate. It's probably safe to eat, I don't know. It's a very explosive compound that is impact sensitive. So when that hammer drops onto it, it will detonate and fire the gun. One interesting thing about this, we think of these as mountain man rifles. I've had the distinct privilege that I live in Wyoming. I get to go hunting in Wyoming. The downside of that is I get to go hunting where there's really tall mountains. And these guns are probably both the bottom one's a little heavier. It's probably closer to 15 pounds. The one above it might be 12 or 13. I would dread to drag that thing up a mountain, so they must have been a lot tougher than me. Actually, I'm sure they were tougher than me. As I said, I complained about 40 degrees the other day. But this is the classic mountain man rifle. It's a Hawken rifle. It's a single-shot muzzle-loading rifle, a very heavy barrel, heavy caliber for taking down large game in the American West. Whether or not they carried it up the mountain or they put it on their horse or however they got it there. Interestingly, most of the survivors of these guns all show signs of really heavy use. There's not a lot of pristine of these left, so the people that were buying them were really using them up. And there's a great image. That's the barrel mark you'll see on this, S. Hawken, St. Louis. It might be a little bit tough to read with the light coming in, but you'll just have to trust me. Another muzzle loader we're thinking about in this early sort of pre-Civil War time frame is a trade gun. So most European nations and the early American nation, we all had some sort of trade at times with various Native American nations. So there's some that are allied, some that are enemies, some that are in negotiations, some that, as all these treaties developed, one of the primary trade goods was firearms and gunpowder and munitions. And so it looks a lot like this. This is what we would call a Northwest trade gun. And despite it being flintlock, if you know your firearms history, you know that flintlocks really are phased out in the 1830s, 1840s. We move over to the percussion system that I just described. Native Americans actually tended to prefer flintlocks well after they had been sort of discarded by Europeans. And so this one's actually probably an 1860s gun that's still originally made as a flintlock. They're very distinct. They're very, very lightweight. That's something that Native users prioritized. They also typically carry the symbol of the Hudson Bay Company. That was one of the primary English makers that brought them into North America. There's distinct styles to these. So trade guns, whether they're being sold in the Northwest or in the Southeast, they all have different styles based on the time period. It's a really fascinating subject. It's not my strength, but the trade guns are an important firearm for that early Western period. You'll see these showing up in the later West too, as these guns all had very long lives. Guns are a commodity, they're valuable. They're not something to just throw in the trash. Once a new one comes out, they get reused, they get used for a long, long time. So you might see a trade gun that comes from the 1850s show up in places like Little Bighorn or in other places out west much, much later. The American Civil War. So we get up to the American Civil War, and that isn't necessarily something I'll talk a lot about because we're talking about the West, and the Civil War is mostly an East Coast affair. But it has a big impact on guns in the West because both sides of the Civil War mobilized these huge armies. We're talking well over 1 million soldiers involved, a couple million actually involved if you total up everybody. Both sides manufacture and import huge numbers of firearms. And then in 1865, the government decides, you know what? Army is going to shrink back down to 25,000. It's going to go from like 2 million to 25,000 soldiers. We have all these guns for 2 million. We don't need that many guns. Sell them all off. So they sell off most of the stockpiles of munitions from the Civil War, and they sell them very, very, very cheaply. So whereas a Winchester you'll see here in a minute might cost $30 or $35, you might be making $1 a day. One of these might cost $1 or $2. So it might not be as good as a Winchester, a brand new Winchester, but it's pretty good. And that's way cheaper. That's 90% off your firearm right there or more. And so that's a pretty good deal. And a lot of people would buy these and then take them out west. And that would happen for decades after. So all sorts of Civil War guns, like these carbines. So these are breech loading carbines. These are a little bit more advanced. They look familiar to the percussion. They look similar to the percussion guns. These are both breech loaders. So on the Star, which is on the left-hand side, as you view it, that comes the lever that's the trigger guard that drops down. You bring the hammer to half cock and you can insert a paper cartridge in there, later metallic cartridges, and close that all up and fire it. So you don't have to do the muzzle loading. Still have to kind of cock the gun and go through those motions, but You're not muzzle loading each individual component down the barrel. Now you're putting all those as one contained cartridge into the breech, which is a big step forward in firearms. You're also doing a very similar process in the Merrill carbine here. Mostly I picked those two not because they're especially well-known guns. If you're familiar with Civil War history, you've probably heard of like the Sharps or something like that, or maybe the Henry or the Spencer. I picked those because those were the kind of guns, the Star and the Merrill and lots of others, those were the first to get discarded because they were the least liked by the soldiers that used them. So they were the cheapest. And of course, along with the long guns of the Civil War that get sold off, there's also a lot of the handguns of the Civil War. When we look at guns today, whether it's, say, from the Revolutionary War, I joked about the Patriot, the Civil War, we think of them, an old gun is an old gun is an old gun. That's an old revolver, that's an old musket. They all seem pretty similar to us. But one of the things we learn in reading about these guns from primary sources, from soldiers' writings especially, they had very clear differences of opinion. You know, I'm sure if we went around the room and talked to all the gun guys in the room about your favorite firearm, we could start some arguments tonight. Maybe after a few more of those whiskeys, we can really get into it. But the soldiers of the time period had the same kind of differences. They saw value and they knew what the good one was from the bad one. You know, just like we know a lemon when we buy a bad car today, they knew it when they had a bad gun in their hands. The one in particular is the center one up there on the top row. That's the Joslin revolver. And actually, soldiers often, there's a strain of complaints. The Union bought 2,000 of those during the Civil War, and they often got discarded. That was how poorly the soldiers thought of them. They generally referred to them as scrap iron or bar iron, which is not exactly high praise. Especially if you don't have it, you know, both sides are pretty desperate for guns. So if you're throwing away a gun, it's a pretty serious discredit, I guess. And then I'll mention the Star revolver here. I didn't include this in the slides, but the Star revolver, the Bryan Museum has a really great example of a Star revolver up in the case on display right now. This one's just sort of a plain military contract gun, but there's a really nice engraved one up there on view. So the next time you're in the museum and go by that gun case that's upstairs, look for that engraved Star. As I mentioned, surplus of all kinds, some more Civil War surplus. I won't spend too much time on it. Another primary source I mentioned, this is that little invoice right there. Anybody done a bill of sale on anything recently? This is a bill of sale for 20 muskets of model 1822. It's being sold in 1885. So remember how I said there's these long lives to these things because they're sort of good, valuable commodities? This is old pre-Civil War muskets being sold off to a dealer in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places. We actually have one of these slips in our archive from the Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham Company. And it's a crate of nearly the same crate of muskets being sold in 1906 to Montgomery Ward in Chicago. So it's kind of a fun one. And of course, when we get, I mentioned earlier, we think of the pop culture reason for all the lever action rifles, but they were real things. They weren't just in movies. There were some out west, and they were very Western guns. So when you think of the classic Western gun, you're not wrong thinking of the Western lever action rifle. But as I was trying to show, there's more to it. The two we have here on the screen is the top one is the Henry rifle. So I've talked about how, those early muzzle loaders, powder and projectile down the barrel. Put on a percussion cap or a piece of flint and some powder. A Henry rifle is now fully metallic cartridge, very similar to what you would see today if you picked up a cartridge, self-contained priming, powder, and projectile. To load a Henry, there's a little tab. You twist the front just under the rear sight off to the side, and you slide the tab that's in front of the receiver right now all the way up. You twist the front end of the gun there open to expose the magazine. You slide 14 cartridges in. You close that, and then you can fire 14 rounds as fast as you can work the lever, which for most people, even inexperienced users, is pretty quickly. It's a pretty simple gun. This originally comes out during the Civil War. It doesn't really get military adoption. It's expensive. It's sort of complex. The magazine has an opening in the bottom, so dirt and mud can get in there. So the government doesn't really like it, so they don't buy it. Lots of Union soldiers, especially private, purchase these and then use them throughout the Civil War, and then of course a lot of them go out west as well. The next gun down is the Winchester model 1866. That's the first Winchester. So I'm talking about Winchester. We're mentioned that in the sort of the program synopsis tonight, and This is the one that is the first Winchester that would, make that company. It grew out of the Henry Rifle and the New Haven Arms Company. If you want a long lecture on corporate restructuring in the 1860s, that's a different evening. It's much longer, and you will need some whiskey to get through that one. But the Winchester 1866 comes out in 1866. It's similar principles, just a few features. They've enclosed the magazine tube. They've put a handguard on it. A really odd feature of the Henry is because that tab is what you use to slide the magazine spring all the way to the front, you can also induce a failure, because if you put your hand out like you would normally hold a rifle and you work the lever, the magazine spring will slowly push the rounds back into the where they need to go, and eventually it'll run into your hand. And you're in the heat of battle, heat of the moment, you're just racking the lever and nothing's happening. It's because your hand's in the way. So they fixed that on the 66. They fixed it being exposed to mud and dirt, and they also put a side loading gate so you didn't have to do that awkward load from the front necessarily for the magazine. But it's largely the same gun. They're both chambered for 44 Henry, one of those early metallic cartridges. And again, you guys have a great example of a 66 in the collection, actually a couple, I think. But this one here is in the museum collection, sort of a classic mid-1860s, 1870s kind of firearm. These guns show up all over the American West. They make about 160,000 of them. A bunch of them actually get shipped overseas. As Winchester grows as a company, they start to sell internationally as well. So it's not just a Western gun, but it's an international gun. But a great example of one here at the museum. Of course, military operations in the West, even with the reduced Army size, they continue. The Army didn't really use what we think of as the classic Western guns, although you will see them, again, going back to that Hollywood thing. I was traveling not too long ago. I was in the hotel room, flipping through the channels, and there was an old Western on, and I decided to watch it for a little bit. It was actually an episode of The Rifleman, I believe. And the cavalry are depicted in this, and they're all carrying Winchesters. Actually all carrying like 1894s, which is super wrong. But they're all carrying Winchesters, and they should really all be carrying trapdoors of one kind or another. So this is a trapdoor Springfield. I mentioned at the end of the war, the Army shrinks. The government, in the 1860s, the military had a little bit different philosophy. When we think of the modern U.S. military, we're thinking about one of the premier fighting forces that has ever existed. The budget is quite high. Politicians will campaign on nothing, is no expense too great for our troops. All certainly things worth considering. In the 1860s, it was the exact opposite. Cut the military budget. We don't need an army. We don't need a standing army. Do we even have a standing army? It was absolutely a different environment in that time frame. So one of the ways that shows itself is the trapdoor Springfield gets its name from an actual trapdoor. So I can't really show it to you here. It's much easier to hold one and show it to you, but this will have to do. It looks like those old muzzle loaders, but it has been converted to breech loading. So what they did is, at the end of the Civil War, they took all those muzzle loading muskets, they cut out a breech section, they cut the breech off the barrel, they put a new conversion on that, a new conversion receiver on that, and so there is a hinge just in front of the hammer that once you've fired, bring the gun to half cock, you flip up the trap door, insert your cartridge, close the trap door, full cock, fire the gun. So it is a breech loading conversion to an earlier muzzle loading rifle. And these would be used by the U.S. Army throughout its campaigns in the West. They never really adopted any kind of lever actions. That was, if you were a trooper in the 7th or in any other military operation, you had a trapdoor rifle or carbine. Another gun that comes up a lot in the West is the Gatling gun. That's one of Hollywood's favorite things. And in my curatorial career, I've learned a couple things. If you decide to switch fields, here's my advice. Visitors love one of two things. They love really, really small or really, really large. Those things are always winners in a museum setting. Everything else is a lot more nuanced. Gatling guns check the large box, they check the shiny box, and they look really good on TV. So they're always used very dramatically in sort of TV and movie about the West. They show up all the time. If you dig into how they were used, sort of famously, anybody know a little bit about Custer's campaign that resulted in the Battle of Little Bighorn? I'm sure a few of you have read about that. He famously he had Gatling guns available to him, he left them behind, and that becomes this what if of, could he have won the battle with those? Probably not. Custer, the Little Bighorn's a mess. If you're Civil War historians in the crowd and know the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Gettysburg is about the same area as the Battle of the Little Bighorn in terms of land area. Battle of Gettysburg has nearly 200,000 people crammed into that space. Custer had 700. He was trying to cover that same frontage. It's a bit of a tough ask. Anyways, military tactics aside, that's, again, I'm giving you all these separate lectures for free here. The Gatling gun, it was too heavy, so they almost always just left it behind. Troops didn't like lugging it around. They were trying to fight Native Americans who traveled very light, very quickly. These guns were sort of an impediment to that. So there's about 3 instances where Gatling guns are fired in anger in all of the American West. Other than that, they sort of just sit in garrison and collect dust. They're not really actually that successful. They are, however, very, very dramatic. So they make great screenwriting material. So people think of the Gatling gun as the Western firearm, but it's not really. So that's my soapbox about that. And then back to the 73s. So those guns that we showed at the beginning, the classic Western gun, the Winchester 1873, it's an evolution of that to 1866. All the same features. This one's just chambered in a center fire cartridge, as cartridge technology involves. It's also, you'll notice that it's a steel receiver instead of a brass receiver. A few updates, but with these few updates, this becomes known as the gun that won the West. That's a little bit of a Winchester marketing slogan, so don't buy into it too much. But the truth there is they sold a ton of these. They sold over 700, 1,000 of these guns in its production life. And so it was all over the American West. It was very expensive, but if you could afford it, this was the best gun you could have in the American West. It's sort of similar. You load up, depending on the barrel length, affects the magazine tube length. So you could have as many as 15 rounds in the magazine, fired as fast as you can work the lever. The other 1873 is the Colt 1873. These guns came out in the same year. The Colt 1873 is a classic single action revolver, like you've seen if you've seen a gunfighter draw and shoot the bad guy in the movie, you've seen a Colt 1873. It's a 6-shot, officially, firearm. You don't really want to carry 6 rounds in the cylinder because there is absolutely 0 hammer safety on the original design. So when you load that gun up, you drop the lever as you would carry it around. The firing pin on the other side of that hammer is resting on the primer. So then you have loaded up 6 rounds and you got to go work cattle for the day. You're going to bounce around on a horse all day. That hammer is bouncing around on that primer all day until it shoots you in the leg. And then you're very far away from any kind of medical attention. So the modern practice is to only load 5 and keep the hammer on an empty chamber. Some people did that back then, some people didn't. But if you wanted to not shoot yourself in the leg, carry 5 in a Colt single action. At least on an original. Modern reproductions tend to have a transfer bar safety to prevent that very problem. And you can see here a really good internal diagram from this advertisement. This is a period advertisement for the Winchester showing the toggle link action that works inside of there. So anybody here, it's a really firearms aficionado, a firearms nerd. You've probably heard toggle link used when you're talking about like a Luger pistol from World War I. Winchester 73 on the inside, if you've never seen the guts of one, is actually a toggle link action on the internals. Very reliable, very easy to work on gun. And of course, mentioned you guys have some great examples here, including there's a 1 in 1,000 in the Bryan Museum Collection. This is sort of the holy grail of Winchester collecting. Brief aside here, a 1 in 1,073 was a marketing campaign by Winchester. They wrote this big publication that said, we test every single barrel, which was probably true, and we pick the best out of every 1,000, the most accurate barrel out of every 1,000, and we build that into a really special rifle. And that's what this was. The problem is they probably didn't actually do that, because if you look at the records, they made 700,000 rifles. There should be 700 guns, and they tended to make them in batches. They show up in like groups of 5 in the records, which is a little suspicious if you're trying to believe their marketing story on that one. But the truth of the matter is they did not make a lot of these guns. So this is one of the rarer Winchesters out there today. They ended up making like 153 of the 700,000 Winchesters. So the 73s were 1 in 1,000. They have this very distinct marking right there. They have a platinum band on the receiver and the barrel. And that movie poster at the beginning, Winchester 73, it's about Jimmy Stewart trying to track down a 1 in 1,000 Winchester. How to ID a Winchester, as long as we're talking about this, is you read the tang. It's very technical art that I have to be a professional in, but Winchesters are most old 19th century Winchesters are marked on the tang with their model. Their model designations get a lot more complicated later, but they're always identified by the model year, which some people mistake for the year the gun was made, but they would make this into the 1920s, just the model year. Another classic of the American West, coach guns, the classics, you're riding shotgun. Two here pictured the classic side-by-side and a Winchester lever action version. The one on top is marked to the Adams Express Company. The one on the bottom is marked to, you can just see there maybe, Amexco for American Express. Anybody got an American Express in their wallets? Not to ask your financial history here, but anybody got a card? Same company. They used to issue Winchester lever action shotguns. I think the "Don't Leave Home Without It" slogan still works. That's up for you to decide. But you see, of course, lots of coach guns. Shotguns were imported, mostly imported in this time in the U.S. There weren't a lot of side-by-side makers until later domestically, but that's that classic sawed-off, short-barreled shotgun riding coach. That existed. They're pretty rare today. I also won't tell anybody how to be fraudulent, but if you find yourself looking at one of these guns, just know that the easiest way to take an old rusty shotgun and make it more valuable is to claim it was a coach gun and then take it to the gun show and see how much cash you can get for it. So if you ever think you found the greatest one, I would advise you be very, very careful. They are very often faked. One of the guns we have on the table over there, I'll talk about in just a second, is related to this. This is the Winchester 1894. As I just mentioned, comes out in 1894. This is an advertisement. We think about all these guns I've talked about so far. These are all guns that are made on the East Coast. These are all guns made in factories mostly in Connecticut, what was then called the Gun Valley in Connecticut, from all the firearms manufacturing that happened there. They're all shipped out west. This one is actually invented in the West by a guy named John M. Browning. If you're around firearms, you know the name. Most prolific firearms inventor of all times. John Browning, him and his brothers worked in a shop in Ogden, Utah, where they invented the Winchester 1894, among many other things. Winchester 1894 becomes the best-selling Winchester of all time. Many people in this room have probably hunted with one or shot one or even own one now. I think they're up to 8 million made over the course, and they're still making them. Hopefully you'll tolerate my slight joke there, the son of a gun on the table. It is actually the descendant of that rifle on the table there tonight. That rifle is a harmonica gun. So step back into the presentation a little bit. That harmonica gun was made by John Browning's father. He first invented those when he was working as a gunsmith in Illinois. And that harmonica rifle was an early repeating. So remember those single-shot Hawkins I showed you? That is the same. That is a contemporary of those. So 1850s, when everything's still mostly single-shot, John Browning's dad comes out with a 5-shot, up to 20-shot, he claimed, repeating rifle that he can make for you that is a harmonica gun. If you come up here and look at it, you'll see instantly why it's called a harmonica gun, because the chambers are arranged horizontally and they slide through the action as you fire each one. It's not a cartridge gun, so you still have to load each chamber manually, but it is an improvement over single-shot muzzle loaders. And he passed on his gunsmithing talents to his son, and his son would go on to invent the Winchester 1894 and many, many other guns. Anybody in here with prior military service will know one of his designs, the M2 heavy machine gun, still in service with the U.S. Army. That was invented by John Browning, and that thing will probably be in service with the U.S. Army until the end of time. One of the just most reliable machine gun designs of all time. He invented that. He invented the Winchester 94, among many, many other guns. As you can see there, the price in lever actions has come down. So this is an advertisement from the 1890s. Anybody got a 20 on them tonight? You could afford a Winchester in the 1890s. You probably weren't making that much money, but you could afford one if you got 20 bucks. And again, another one, a great example here from the Bryan Museum Collection is this one to Herb Cunningham, exhibition shooter. One of those sort of classic early 20th century entertainment acts was exhibition shooting. So a really great example of a 94 here in the collection locally. So this sort of leads to a question that I like to ask: what wasn't out west? Almost everything was out west in some form or another. We don't think of semi-automatic pistols, or what they would call self-loading pistols, as something that's very Western, but they come out at the turn of the 1900s, so those are certainly out west. And actually in Cody's not a very typical Western town. Buffalo Bill founds it intentionally to be a tourist town. It's founded pretty late. We have two things. You'll see another gun from Cody I'll talk about in a minute. There's one major gunfight in Cody for an Old West town that's a little bit on the low side. We really love that number to be up, so we have some more Western chops. But the one Western gunfight that happened in town happened across from the very famous Irma Hotel. There was a bank across the street at the time, which is now a jerky shop. And the guys go in, the two guys rob the bank, they shoot one of the tellers, they hop out the window. People in the Irma hear all this commotion, they run out into the street, a gunfight ensues, and the local newspaper describes it as new automatics, based on when the newspaper, where the event happened, and the guns available at the time. It was actually very likely an early Colt 1900 or 1902 that they're describing, which is really interesting that a gunfight happened in Cody with that. Another really cool thing, if you ever come see us, you go through the Buffalo Bill Museum, you'll look for a painting with a bullet hole in it. And there's a bullet still lodged in that painting from that gunfight. It was hanging in the Irma at the time and took one of the stray rounds during that gunfight. Another really fun one for me, I live in tourist country. I imagine you guys get quite a few tourists going to see the beach. Anybody know some National Park Service trivia about when the Park Service was founded? Anybody? All right, it's 1916. Yellowstone became a national park in 1872. It's the oldest national park. I won't do the quick math because I'm a historian, but that's quite a while where there's no National Park Service, but we do have a national park. And in that time, it was actually the Army's job to patrol the park. The Army didn't have any special rules for patrolling the park. Again, those of you who've served probably know the Army's kind of a one-size-fits-all sort of institution, so they just rotated units through. And in the early 1900s, that meant occasionally they would rotate through machine gun detachments. So the photo on the left is a U.S. Army detachment doing garrison duty in Yellowstone with a Maxim machine gun. That's a 250 round belt attached to that thing. There is ammo in the belt, and they are at, I believe, Mammoth Hot Springs or somewhere nearby. So if you ever see a park ranger, there are some armed law enforcement out in the park today, but they definitely do not have Maxim machine guns. The photo on the right's a little bit blurrier. There's not a very good photo of this version, but this is a similar unit. They're on parade. It's a mounted machine gun unit. So it's the same gun, but it's all tacked up on a horse because they're using horses at this time. But that was what tourist patrol looked like in Yellowstone in the early 1900s. You might run into an actual machine gun. I mentioned automatics. Another automatic that was available in the early American West is this C96 Mauser. Most people know it from World War I. It's a German World War I sidearm. Comes out in 1896. It is also sold commercially before the war to the U.S. There was an importer in New York who would sell these, and they actually advertised it. Let's see, where's the phrase that I'm looking there? But it has been adopted by many military governments and as an offensive or defensive weapon for military, sheriffs, prospectors, or surveyors, cowboys, and frontiersmen. It has no equal. So they're very intentionally marketed to this gun to Western folks, and a few of them show up out west. And the photo on the left, again, I don't have a great version of this photo, that is a Texas Ranger, and in his hands is a C96 Mauser. So I imagine if I polled the crowd, you wouldn't have guessed a Texas Ranger carried one of these, but there is certainly photographic evidence that they had a couple. And then this next photo, I mentioned we're going back to this photo. You see this stack of guns. In this stack of guns, you can see some Winchesters, you can see some lever actions, and there's tucked in behind is another C96. These are some guys in Oklahoma. So it's kind of weird. We don't think of that as a Western gun, but there's photographs that say otherwise. I would call all of those dudes look pretty Western to me. I don't know what the definition is, but the dude on the left, his mustache is Western, if nothing else. Another good Cody gun, we think of Cody, as I said, is not a very Western town for a number of reasons. One of the reasons it is very Western, it does have a thriving prostitution scene. Cassie Waters is a local hero to Codyites, so don't go to town and bad talk her. We all like her a lot. But she ran a brothel in the early days of Cody. And she got this pistol as a gift. We don't know who she got it from. We have a really good idea, though, because there was a doctor in town, and his wife and Cassie showed up to the same store on the same day wearing the same dress from the same guy. And then he left town. And like I said, we don't know who gave this to her, but we have a good idea. It's inscribed to my friend Cassie, every inch a lady, very suggestively. It's a gold-plated Hopkins & Allen. It has mother of pearl grips. This is a weird gun to me for a number of reasons, one of which being Hopkins & Allen is not a nice gun. If you're in the Old West, that's pretty cheap. You know, you really want to hold out for like a Smith & Wesson or something nicer from your side piece. Like, he really cheaped out, is all I'm saying. He did get it gold-plated. He did get the nice grips. He did get it engraved. And this is allegedly, I can't prove it was him. It just seems really suspicious that he left town. That's all I'm saying. But this was her gun. She became, as many brothel owners and prostitutes in the Old West, they actually sort of became the local stability because the cowboys were coming into town, spending all their money, wasting all their money. They were tending to collect their money and reinvest it in the town. So that's a big reason why Cassie is a hero to Cody. She also would regularly take Buffalo Bill's parking spot at the Irma. So that's another reason we like her. Speaking of Buffalo Bill, this is a photo of his hunting camp. So this is another one of those great kind of weird guns show up in the West. And this one, he is there pictured with lots of performers from Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And you can zoom in, you'll see all sorts of guns. You see lever actions there, one of the native performers. I think that's Chief Irontail, maybe. You see some more lever actions. You see Buffalo Bill's holding a gun. That gun is actually still in the collection. And then this one, it's a really grainy photo, but it's another one of those weird things that, why is this in Pahaska, Wyoming in about 1903? And it's either an Argentinian or Spanish Mauser cavalry carbine, probably captured there's one of two ways this got to the U.S. It was either captured during the Spanish-American War and then made its way through a few different hands to this hunting camp in Wyoming, or one of the South American performers who regularly toured with Buffalo Bill brought it with them and gave it. But it's a really unusual gun. It wasn't sold commercially in the West. This had to pass through a lot of hands, but here it is sitting in this photo in this hunting camp in Wyoming, which is kind of, it's interesting to me at least. Hopefully it's interesting to you. So that's a little bit of an overview about guns in the West. I think I left enough time for questions, hopefully. Like I said, there's two really great guns. I didn't talk as much about the revolver. There's a really awesome engraved revolver up here that's got a lot of different Texas Ranch brands on it, so that's a very cool gun. The Harmonica Rifle, I didn't make a big deal about this. This is actually the first one of these I've seen in person. I see a lot of guns. It's my profession. I'm very fortunate to have that profession. That's the first one I've seen in person. It's a very, very rare gun, a very interesting part of firearms history. So if you have the chance, spend some time, come up and look at these. They're really special pieces that I would be jealous to have in my collection, and definitely don't check my bags when I leave tomorrow. So anyway, with that, I'll be happy to take some questions. Yes?